Hello everyone, welcome to today's presentation. I'm excited to share with you our topic, Mechanics and Dynamics of Pulmonary Ventilation. Under this title, we'll explore how our lungs function, how air flows through the respiratory system, and what factors influence airway resistance. Over the next few slides, we'll delve into these fascinating aspects of lung physiology. So let's get started. Today, we're going to take a closer look at the mechanics and dynamics of pulmonary ventilation. This chapter is really about understanding how airflow moves through our respiratory system and how our lungs expand and recoil during breathing. It's the foundation for much of what we study in respiratory physiology and related fields. We'll explore the patterns of airflow, how air travels through the respiratory tract, and why understanding these patterns is so important for assessing respiratory efficiency and overall health. Next, we'll focus on the forces involved in lung expansion and recoil. These forces are critical because they allow our lungs to fill with air and then empty effectively during each breath cycle. We'll also look at how the structures of the lung and chest wall interact. This interaction is fundamental for maintaining proper respiratory function. Without it, breathing wouldn't be as efficient as it needs to be. Finally, we'll discuss the basic mechanics of ventilation, covering lung volumes, pressures, and airflow dynamics. This helps us understand how all these elements work together to make breathing possible. So, this chapter really ties together the physical principles underlying how we breathe, which is essential for understanding respiratory health and function. Now, let's take a closer look at the mechanics and dynamics of pulmonary ventilation, starting with elastic fiber stretching. As the lung volume increases during inhalation, the elastic fibers within the lung tissue stretch correspondingly. This stretching is really important because it's the primary reason we see recoil pressures rise as the lungs expand. In other words, the more the fibers stretch, the more they want to spring back to their original shape, creating that recoil force. Moving on, when the lung is airless, say at the very end of exhalation or if it's collapsed, it exhibits no recoil force at all. This state is essentially our baseline in lung mechanics, the point where no forces are acting to expand or compress the lung. It's like the starting point before any expansion begins. Finally, let's consider the relaxation pressure curves. These curves visually depict the relationship between lung recoil pressure and how much the lung has expanded. They show us that as lung volume increases, recoil pressure also increases progressively. This helps us understand how the lung's elastic properties respond to different volumes, which is crucial for understanding normal and abnormal respiratory mechanics. All these concepts tie together to give us a comprehensive picture of how our lungs work during breathing. Let's take a closer look at the residual volume dynamics. At residual volume, which is the amount of air remaining in the lungs after a full exhalation, the thorax tends to spring outward quite forcefully. This outward movement creates a negative recoil pressure, meaning the lungs and thorax are exerting a pulling force to stay expanded. These recoil forces are important because they significantly influence our overall respiratory mechanics, helping us understand how the lungs and chest work together during breathing. Now, moving to about 70% of vital capacity, or VC, we see a different behavior. At this point, the thorax reaches a sort of equilibrium. There's no recoil force pushing or pulling. It's like a neutral zone where the recoil forces are balanced, which again plays a key role in how easily we can breathe comfortably at different lung volumes. Finally, when we look at the thoracic behavior at total lung capacity, or TLC, the maximum amount of air the lungs can hold, the situation reverses. Here, the thorax recoils inward, producing a positive recoil pressure. This inward movement helps us understand the elastic properties of the lungs and chest and how they contribute to the mechanics of breathing. Throughout all these points, what's most important to remember is that the recoil forces, whether outward at low volumes or inward at high volumes, are fundamental in shaping the overall respiratory mechanics. They help us understand the natural elasticity of the lungs and chest and how these forces facilitate efficient ventilation. Let's talk about the mechanics and dynamics of pulmonary ventilation, specifically focusing on elastic and frictional resistance. First, elastic resistance arises from the elasticity of the lung tissue and the chest wall. Think of it as the natural springiness of these tissues that resist their expansion and contraction. This resistance is present both when the lungs are at rest, what we call static conditions, and when air is flowing, that is, during dynamic conditions. It's a significant factor in normal lung mechanics because it influences how easily the lungs can expand and recoil. In fact, elastic resistance tends to be greater than frictional resistance in healthy lungs, highlighting its predominant role in ventilation. Now, moving to frictional resistance, this only occurs during airflow. It's the resistance created by the air moving through the airways, and it directly impacts the work of breathing. When you breathe in, your respiratory muscles have to work against this friction to push the air in. Interestingly, frictional resistance isn't present when the lungs are static, meaning if there's no airflow, there's no frictional resistance to overcome. And in normal conditions, this resistance is less significant compared to elastic resistance. So, when we compare elastic and frictional resistance, elastic resistance is the major player in how our lungs function during normal breathing. It influences the ease of lung expansion, while frictional resistance becomes more relevant during active airflow. Understanding this balance helps us appreciate how our respiratory system works efficiently under normal circumstances, and how it might be affected in disease states. Let's take a closer look at the mechanics and dynamics of pulmonary ventilation, starting with understanding airway resistance. Airway resistance is really the main source of what's called non-elastic resistance in the respiratory system. Essentially, it's the friction that opposes the flow of air through the airways. This frictional force can vary depending on different factors, which makes it quite dynamic in nature. Now, this friction isn't a static thing. It changes as the airflow rate changes and as the condition of the airways themselves change. For example, if the airflow increases during vigorous breathing, the resistance can also increase because of greater friction. Conversely, if the airways are constricted or partially blocked, resistance can rise significantly, making it harder for air to pass through. This brings us to the impact of airway conditions on resistance. The state of the airways, things like diameter and presence of obstructions, play a crucial role. Narrower airways or obstructions lead to higher resistance, which means more effort is needed to move air in and out. That's where the role of driving pressure comes in. To overcome this resistance, a certain amount of pressure, called driving pressure, is essential. It acts as the force that pushes air through the airways despite the resistance encountered. Without sufficient driving pressure, airflow could be compromised. So, understanding these dynamics helps us appreciate how the respiratory system adapts and responds during different breathing conditions, ensuring effective ventilation even when resistance varies. Let's take a closer look at the influence of airway properties on pulmonary ventilation. These fluctuations in airflow and pressure are significantly affected by the characteristics of the airways themselves, such as their diameter and resistance. When air moves through the airways, any variation in these properties can alter how easily air flows in and out of the lungs. Additionally, changes in lung volume also play a crucial role in these dynamics. As the lungs expand and contract, they interact with the chest wall, creating a complex system of mechanical forces. These interactions are not static. They fluctuate as breathing occurs, involving pressures and resistances that change moment to moment. Understanding these dynamic interactions is essential because they form the backbone of how we breathe normally. The mechanics of the lung and chest wall work together to facilitate airflow, but they can also become disrupted in certain pathological conditions. Recognizing how these forces behave during normal ventilation helps us better understand what goes wrong when ventilation is impaired. In essence, the mechanics of breathing are a dynamic, finely tuned system, and being aware of how airway properties and lung volume changes influence this system is key to both understanding healthy respiration and diagnosing respiratory issues. Let's talk about the mechanics and dynamics of pulmonary ventilation, focusing on airway resistance. Airway resistance, or RAW, actually comes from the friction that occurs both between gas molecules and between the gas and the walls of the airways. We measure this resistance in centimeters of water per liter per second, or cm H2O L-sec. Now, several factors influence this resistance. For example, higher viscosity of the gas, meaning thicker or more viscous gases, can increase resistance. Similarly, narrower airways also raise resistance because there's less space for the air to flow through. When resistance goes up, the body needs to generate greater pressure to keep the airflow steady. Gas viscosity plays a significant role here. As viscosity increases, so does friction, which means more resistance. This is important because it affects how easily we can breathe, especially in different physiological or pathological conditions. Typically, normal airway resistance ranges from about 0.5 to 1.5 cm H2O L-sec. This is considered the typical range for healthy individuals, giving us a baseline to compare against when assessing lung function. The dimension of the airway itself is crucial. Narrower airways mean more friction between the gas and the airway walls, which translates into higher resistance. So, understanding these factors helps us appreciate how various conditions can impact airflow and breathing efficiency, tying back to the overall theme of pulmonary mechanics. Now, let's take a closer look at the mechanics and dynamics of pulmonary ventilation, starting with laminar flow in the airways. In this type of airflow, the gas moves smoothly in parallel layers, almost like a gentle stream. This usually happens in the smaller airways, where the flow rates are lower, making the movement more streamlined and less chaotic. Next, we have turbulent flow, which is quite different. Turbulent flow is characterized by chaotic, swirling currents within the respiratory tract. Think of it as the air moving in a more disorderly fashion, creating eddies and vortices. This kind of flow typically occurs in the larger airways or during periods of heavy breathing, such as during exertion or distress. Now, moving on to flow regimens in the airways, particularly tracheobronchial flow. This is also known as transitional flow because it exhibits features of both laminar and turbulent flow. It's especially prominent at airway branch points, where the airflow transitions from one type to another. Understanding these dynamics helps us grasp how airflow adapts throughout the respiratory system, ensuring efficient ventilation under varying conditions. Let's talk about the mechanics and dynamics of pulmonary ventilation, focusing on laminar flow. Laminar flow is essentially made up of organized, cylindrical layers of gas that move smoothly and in a streamlined fashion. It's what you might imagine as a gentle, orderly flow, where particles slide past each other without much disturbance. This kind of flow is important because it reflects how air moves through the smaller airways under normal conditions. Now, a key factor influencing this flow is the airway radius. According to Poiseuille's law, as the radius of the airway decreases, the pressure needed to keep the same amount of airflow increases dramatically. In fact, even a small reduction in radius can lead to a large increase in the effort required to breathe. This highlights just how sensitive airflow dynamics are to changes in airway size. A tiny narrowing can make breathing much more difficult. When it comes to the characteristics of laminar flow, one crucial aspect is how work of breathing is affected by airway diameter. For example, if you have the airway radius, the pressure needed to maintain the same flow actually goes up by a factor of 16. That's a huge increase, and it directly impacts the effort a person has to put in to breathe. So, understanding these relationships helps us grasp why certain conditions that narrow the airways, like asthma or COPD, can significantly increase the work of breathing. It all ties back to the importance of airway size and flow dynamics in pulmonary function. Let's take a closer look at how changes in airway radius impact pulmonary ventilation. When the airway radius decreases by just 50%, the pressure needed to keep airflow steady actually increases dramatically, by about 16 times. This is a powerful illustration of how sensitive airflow resistance is to changes in airway size. This relationship is explained by Poiseuille's law, which tells us that resistance to flow is inversely proportional to the fourth power of the radius. So, even small reductions in airway radius can lead to substantial increases in the effort required to breathe. Understanding this helps us see why airway constriction, such as in asthma or other respiratory conditions, can make breathing significantly more difficult. It's a clear demonstration of how the mechanics and dynamics of pulmonary ventilation are tightly linked to airway structure. This concept underscores the importance of maintaining open airways for efficient breathing and highlights the challenges faced when airway narrowing occurs. Now, let's take a closer look at the mechanics and dynamics of pulmonary ventilation, focusing on turbulent and transitional flow. Turbulent flow is characterized by chaotic, swirling movement of gases in multiple directions, which makes it quite different from the smooth, orderly laminar flow we often think about. This type of flow tends to occur in narrow or sharply branching airways, where the airflow speed increases and the flow becomes more chaotic. One important aspect of turbulent flow is how it influences breath sounds. When airflow becomes turbulent, it produces sounds like wheezing or crackles that we can often hear during auscultation. Additionally, turbulent flow impacts airflow resistance, meaning it can make breathing slightly more effortful, especially during conditions that promote turbulence. Moving on, transitional flow, especially in the tracheobronchial region, is a blend of laminar and turbulent characteristics. This kind of flow usually occurs at airway bifurcations, those points where airways split into smaller branches. Transitional flow influences breath sounds as well, often contributing to the sounds we hear in normal and abnormal breathing. It also affects airflow resistance, but in a way that's intermediate between laminar and turbulent flow. To sum up, understanding these flow types, turbulent and transitional, is crucial because they directly impact how we perceive breath sounds and how much effort is needed to breathe. Recognizing these flow patterns helps us better interpret respiratory health and diagnose potential issues. Now, let's talk about the breath sounds over the trachea and larger bronchi. These sounds tend to be high-pitched, and they are quite harsh and tubular in quality. This characteristic arises because of the turbulent airflow that occurs in these central airway regions. Recognizing these sounds is crucial because they help us assess conditions affecting the main airways, like obstructions or inflammation. Moving on to the peripheral lung areas, the breath sounds here are noticeably softer and lower in pitch compared to those over the trachea and bronchi. This difference is due to the laminar, or smooth, airflow in these smaller, more distal airways. Understanding these distinctions is vital when evaluating peripheral airway conditions, such as early stages of lung disease. In summary, the key takeaway is that the nature of breath sounds varies depending on the location within the lungs, and these variations are essential tools for us in clinical assessment. Recognizing whether sounds are harsh and tubular or softer and lower-pitched guides us in pinpointing the affected areas and understanding the underlying pathology. Let's take a closer look at the mechanics and dynamics of pulmonary ventilation. First, notice that the upper airways, which include the trachea and bronchi, tend to have turbulent airflow. This turbulence actually contributes to about 50% of the total airway resistance when the lungs are at functional residual capacity, or FRC. Now, moving down to the smaller, distal airways, those less than 3 millimeters in diameter, they experience laminar flow, which is much smoother. These airways account for less than 10% of the total airway resistance in healthy lungs. It's important to understand that in healthy individuals, the lower airway resistance remains quite low, under 10%. However, this balance can be disrupted by certain diseases, like emphysema, chronic bronchitis, or asthma, which can cause the resistance in the lower airways to increase significantly. In fact, in these conditions, the resistance in the lower airways can reach or even surpass 50%, impacting airflow and ventilation efficiency. This shift in resistance distribution highlights how diseases can alter normal lung mechanics, emphasizing the importance of understanding both the upper and lower airway contributions to overall airway resistance.